As a Christian, how are you doing? How is your life? Are you serving the Lord? Are you following the Lord? Is He Lord of your life? Today we're going to be talking about an interesting question that was asked by Isaiah to Israel for Israel to consider. And it's a question that we can ask ourselves for us to consider. Is your fruit worthless? We're going to talk about that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. And today, I'm here with my friend Jake Curtis, and Jake and I are going to continue our study in the wonderful book of Isaiah. We're going to be in the 5th chapter today, and we're going to do the first 7 verses, and you'll see why in a minute. But we're going to ask ourselves an interesting question, and that is my fruit worthless? And we'll ask that. Isaiah asked that, and we're going to talk about it today. Are you ready to get going?
I'm ready, yeah.
This is a great section. There's only 7 verses, but it's going to fill our time as we get into this. We're going to see some interesting things. So let's get right into the word. And let's look at this right away. This section is called the Vineyard. So go ahead and read the first verse, Jake.
Yeah. Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill.
Okay. Now, we start in this Bible study and we read that first verse. So where do we go? What do we ask ourselves in that first verse?
Who's me? Are they really singing? Who's my beloved? Where do you want to start?
Okay. Those are great questions. So we would ask ourselves, who is speaking? Isaiah is speaking.
Yeah.
This is a song. He's going to sing for about 3 verses. This song of prophecy. And we're going to see Isaiah and what he says in his song. Then we can also ask, who is my beloved? And we could say that we can do a little research and see that this is Isaiah's way of addressing God. God is his beloved. I can ask myself an interesting question there is, am I in love with God? Is he, would I describe him, when I pray, do I think of him in the context of not only his love for us, we talk about that a lot, but also, do I really have a love for him? Do I consider him my beloved? Because 3 times in that one verse, God is referred to as Isaiah's beloved. And you can go off and do a study on the word beloved, and that's fine. Then the last question we have in that first verse is God's vineyard. We got to ask ourselves the question of, what's that? Where's that? Who is that? And we're going to talk about that right now. Let's go back to the scriptures here. Now, did that jump out at you as a question?
Yeah, it did, because when he's who's God's vineyard, is he actually talking about a real vineyard, or is it an allegory or a metaphor for something or somebody or something else?
Great question to ask. Now, what I did was, number 1, if you continue to read in Isaiah 5, you get the answer. Look down at verse 7.
For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel.
Yeah, so he's going to answer it in his own context. We're going to talk about this more when we get there, but I looked at some other verses where Israel is described as God's vineyard. And here's some verses right here off verse 7. The house of Israel is God's vineyard. Psalm 80, 8 through 18, Jeremiah 2:21, Jeremiah 12:10, and Hosea 10:1, and other verses. These all talk about Israel as being God's vineyard, that he plants, he nurtures, he takes care of, and he's concerned about as his vineyard. In fact, we even have Jesus uses that same terminology, and we're going to see that in just a second as we go here. So we can say, okay, this is a song Isaiah is singing to God about his vineyard. Now, a little interesting side note in the original language, when it says his vineyard on a fertile hill, do you see that? Are you there, Jake?
Yeah, I'm hardwired in, but it's
All of a sudden you froze
no,
there for a
it's
second. But
weird.
anyway, that term, does your version say on a fertile hill?
It does, a very fertile hill.
Okay. Now, if we look at the footnote there, let me look.
Hmm.
Let me show you. Up here where it says he has had a vineyard on a fertile hill. See that little number 1 there? You go over to verse 1, it says what that literally means in the Hebrew is a horn, the son of fatness. Okay? Now, the translators said, okay, that basically is a reference to fertility. Now, this idea of horn was where we get a horn of plenty, but this was also used throughout the Old Testament as a way of saying God's glory, his provision, the son of fatness. Now, that's interesting, Jake, because right out of the chute, if vineyard is planted by the son of fatness, there's an indication right away that what God has in mind for his vineyard is to produce fatness, is to produce,
Yeah.
okay, abundantly. And so that right away, Israel is described as a place of God that God has certain expectations. Does that make sense there?
Yeah, that
So the
I
very,
hadn't
the
come
very
across
first
that.
verse we see, interesting, we see beloved used 3 times and vineyard used twice. One is, this is a song concerning God's vineyard. My beloved, my well-beloved, had a vineyard on a fertile hill, a hill that's meant to produce. And
Right.
now we're going to see God's actions. Let's read verse 2 from the perspective of look at the actions that God took regarding his vineyard. Go ahead and read verse 2.
He dug it all around, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine, and he built a tower in the middle of it, and he also hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones.
Now, let's look at that and investigate a little bit and think about this. Do you see the actions that he took?
Yeah, dug it around, removed the stones, planted, built a tower.
Yep. In fact, I
Hewed
missed.
it.
He removed that. So I would go in and go here and say, okay, let's see here. He removed. That's another verb. That's another action he took. So he dug, he removed, he planted, and he built, he hewed, he expected.
Oh, yeah.
And so these are actions. Now, what do you notice about all those verbs?
Past tense.
They're all past tense. This is what God has already done. These are things that God has accomplished for his people. And each one of these we can look at when he says he dug around it, he dug a trench around of protection, he removed all the stones, and there have been false stones in Israel since day 1 of Israel, right? And God
Yeah.
removed those, taken away false teachers and false shepherds, and he's put a tower in the middle, right? And then he planted good grapes. Now that term good grapes is important because it means the reddest grapes, these choice grapes. Now we're going to see a comparison in a minute, but basically what this says is God planted good fruit with his people. Do you see anything else in verse 2 that kind of stuck out to you?
A few things. He built a tower, he hewed out a wine vat, and the very last line, but it produced only worthless ones, referring to the
Now,
grapes.
it's interesting. It up to this point, up to the end of that last phrase, it was all the things that God had done. He dug it, he removed, he planted it, he built a tower, he hewed out the wine vat, and he expected it to produce. But if you look, that last phrase is not what God did, it was what it did. So who's the it?
It's the grapes, the inhabitants of the vineyard.
The vineyard, yeah. The vineyard, he expected it to produce good grapes because he gave it the choicest grapes, but it only produced worthless ones. And that's this idea of worthless fruit. Now, it talks about this idea of God's people producing bad fruit. If you look up, it basically says that the vineyard equals God's people. It's also interesting that Jesus talked about the vineyard of God's people also includes the Gentiles. And I'm going to give you the verse for that in a minute, but this section of this song is quoted in Mark chapter 12, verse 1 to 12. Jesus uses this example, and he talks about the vineyard, and God planted the vineyard, and he put in good grapes, and he removed the stones, and he put this tower in the middle, and he hewed out a wine vat. This is a wine press where the wine was made, and he expected it to produce good fruit, and it didn't. And the reason it didn't was he rented the vineyard to bad leaders. And Jesus talks about finally God sent a message. Now he sent prophets like Isaiah to say, hey, be careful about your fruit. And they didn't pay attention to the prophets. So he finally sends his son, and they kill his son. So Jesus says, the Lord's coming, and he's coming in judgment, which is exactly what Isaiah was talking about. And that's why Jesus quotes Isaiah chapter 5, the Song of the Vineyard. And we, as Christians, we need to say, okay, has God put a hedge about me? Yeah, we can find verses where it talks about God putting a hedge around his believers and protecting his believers. Now, there's an interesting little phrase, and this, I got to ask you the question here. Have you thought about, in this verse, when it says, he built a tower in the middle of it? What does that mean to you when it says, he planted it great with choicest vine, and he built a tower in the middle of it and hewed out a vine press? So what was a tower used for?
My ESV says it's a watchtower, so it's a lookout point. So to look out for danger and to...
Okay, when the owner of the vineyard wasn't there, the tower was used as a watchtower, to see if danger was coming. And it was supposed to be used by the people in the vineyard to protect the vineyard. But when the owner came, it was a place where he could go up into the tower and overlook all of his vines, all the fruit. So it had a double use. And Isaiah is going to make the point here. God is coming, looking in your tower, and he's not finding good stuff. And we're going to see that here as we get going. So that the tower as protection, and if you don't man the tower, you're not protecting your vineyard. And the second thing is, if you're not allowing the master to go up in the tower and overlook his vineyard, and if he does, what is he going to see? And that's asking ourselves the question, when God overlooks my life, what exactly does he see? He expects good fruit from us. John 15:5, Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. He it is who abides in me and I in him. He bears much fruit. Not just a little fruit, but he bears much fruit. So God has an expectation to us as his believers, as his vineyard, to bear good fruit. So we got to start asking ourselves some tough questions. Now on to verse 3. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Now, who is talking here?
This is God talking.
Yeah, the song where Isaiah is talking is over. First two verses. Now God is speaking, and he's speaking to Israel, to Jerusalem and Judea. And he's saying, judge between me and my vineyard. Judge between what I want and what I expect and what's actually happening in my vineyard. And then he goes, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? Now, God asks a very interesting question there. What else could I have done for my vineyard? Do you see that question?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to bring up because it makes you reflect and say, what has God done in my life, and am I listening?
And ask the question, God could look at my life and say, Len, what else could I have done for you? I gave you my son who died for your sins, and rose from the dead as a promise for you to have eternal life. Then I gave you the Holy Spirit that helps you in your prayer life and helps you learn, helps you understand the scriptures. So God says, Len, what else could I have done for you that I haven't done? It's an interesting question. So often we are caught up in what has God done for me lately? And it's really good to get God's perspective. And he says, Jake, what else could I have done for you? I've provided for you. I've done all this for you as my precious choice vineyard. And then we see he continues on. This making sense? You see that?
Yeah, it is.
He goes, now, up here in verse 4, he says, what more was there for me to do for my vineyard? Do you see that word for there?
Yeah.
Then down in verse 5, he's going to ask a question. So now, let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. You see the difference?
Yeah. Big difference.
God works for us for our good. And he does so much for us that he could ask, what else could I do for you? And we refuse to produce good grapes like he expects. We produce worthless grapes. I think of Philemon in verse 10 of Philemon, where Paul says, Philemon, when he was a disobedient slave, he was worthless. But now he's worth a lot. He's useful. His fruit is no longer worthless because he ministers to me and I'm sending him to minister to you. So I think of that a lot, of saying, is my fruit of my life, is that useful or not? And I just noticed he goes, now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I go, yikes. Now that word worthless, flip over to the first chapter of Isaiah. We read this.
Bring no more vain things, or bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me.
Vain offering is worthless.
Vain, I think, the same word. Yeah.
Yeah, worthless. So he's talking about then is their worship of him. And now their works in life is worthless because it doesn't produce a reflection of all that God has done for him. So he goes on. Now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. This is judgment. This is Psalm 80, 8 through 19. And it sounds very much like this. My vineyard, and I've planted it, and I've done all this stuff, and now I'm going to take judgment against it because it's producing worthless fruit. He says, I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. In other words, the protection area of the wall will be gone. Mm-hmm. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds no rain. And so this is God's judgment. Now, what is the tense of these verbs?
Future.
These are all future tense. So this is God going to do in the future what is not done in the present by his vineyard. He did a bunch of stuff in the past for us. What more could he do? And we did not in the present produce good fruit. So in the future, he is going to judge. Now, if we're Christians that haven't been walking, we talked about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where if Christ is our foundation, but we don't build on that foundation with any kind of good fruit, our fruit will be burned up. It'll just be ashes. But it says we will be saved, but as through by fire. So maybe you're setting yourself up by not being fruitful, by not having good fruit in your life as a Christian. Now, you're producing good fruit not to gain salvation, but you're producing good fruit because you're saved, because you're God's people, because he's taking care of you and in the vineyard. That make sense?
Yeah, one is a reliance on your works and not on God's grace and mercy.
Where your works ought to be a reflection of the salvation and not a means to gain salvation.
You said it better.
So we ask ourselves the question, how's my fruit? Is the fruit of my life worthless the way it was in Isaiah chapter 1, where he talks about your worship is you're just going through the motions, and I hate it. It's worthless. I want the heart. Are your actions as part of God's vineyard producing excellent fruit, because that's what he planted in you, was excellent fruit? Now let's finish this out. This could be pretty sobering. And then it says this, verse 7, because the vineyard of the Lord is the house of Israel and the men of Judah and his delightful plant. Now, it's also, and I want to read, let's just go to 1. Matthew chapter 21:43 makes the point that believers are his vineyard, but look at 1 Peter chapter 2 and read from verse 7 to verse 10.
So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word, and they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into a marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy.
Now, it doesn't use the word vineyard, but it does obviously here make the point that as Christians, as Gentile Christians, that's who Peter's writing to, as Gentile Christians, we who are not the people of God have become the people of God. You could literally read this. We have become God's precious vineyard because of our faith in Christ. Christ makes that point in Matthew 21. So look at this last verse. He says, you have become his delightful plant. And I can read this verse and I can absolutely say that I, as a Gentile Christian, I have become his delightful plant. And thus, here it is. This is interesting. He looked for justice, but behold, he got bloodshed. That's this idea of shedding the blood of innocence, unrighteous murder here. And that goes back to what Jesus was talking about, where God sends his son to the vineyard and they kill him. So instead of justice, God gets bloodshed. And instead of righteousness, he gets a cry of distress. That word righteousness basically means right acting. Instead of us acting correctly and rightly, what he gets is a cry of distress, because he is not going to sit back and let his vineyard produce worthless. He'll take action to destroy the vineyard so that he can replant it in another people called the Gentiles. And then next week, we're going to talk about the woes for the rest of chapter 5, the woes. And this is in the context of an indictment against the people of his vineyard who are producing worthless fruit. This is God's indictment that is going to say, okay, here's the indictment. Now the just penalty for the indictment is judgment. And Isaiah is saying, here comes the judge, and he's not happy. Now, observations about only these 7 little verses.
Yeah, but they're so rich. There's so much in there to make you question yourself and question what God has done. And are you grateful? Are you being a pleasant, or what was that plant? A pleasant plant, or
Yeah,
a
pleasant
vine?
a fruitful. Is your fruit good or is it worthless?
Yeah.
There was a grape in the Middle East that if it wasn't cultured, it would climb in if it wasn't constantly weeded out. And it was poisonous. Called it the wolf grape. And that's this idea of that your grapes are worthless. They're not even worthy of trying to make it into wine, because it'll be bad wine right from the very start. So often, Jake, we read a set of verses like this and say, okay, this is Isaiah, this is Old Testament, this is a prophet talking about Israel, and this whole thing with the vineyard. We don't understand vineyards unless you've been in California. And I'd recommend go to Napa in California just for the sake of thinking about God's vineyard and asking yourself, are you good grapes like these, or are you producing rotten grapes because of your attitude towards all that God has done for you? So that question of, is your fruit worthless? Is my fruit worthless? Is a question that we can take and really meditate upon and really go to the Lord and say, Lord, I need your help to reinstate the value of the vineyard in light of all that you've done for the vineyard. I want to be that vineyard. I want to be fruitful. And I want my fruit to mean not just, I'm just going to church and just sitting there. No, we can ask ourselves a question. Who are you investing in to produce fruit in them? Interesting question.
Very good questions. Yes.
We'll stop there and go into this next week. Today we've been talking about the quality of our Christian life, the quality of our life as God's vineyard. What kind of fruit are we producing in order to stave off God's dealing with us in our lives in a way that is meant to correct and get us back on track? I want to recommend a video to you. It's called, Hey Christian, what has the Spirit done for you? It's an interesting study. I think you'll find it interesting. And listen, we're going to continue in Isaiah, this wonderful book. We'll do that next week, talking about the woes when we come back. And until then, God bless you.